The sound struck the domes and gilded ceilings, echoing against walls inlaid with mother of pearl. Even the eunuchs trained to mask every reaction held their breath. That cry was forbidden unspeakable because it was not born from a visible wound. It was the echo of a ritual hidden for centuries, a mechanism designed not to break the body but to fracture the soul. History often dresses Ottoman princesses in shimmering silks, pearls and the fragrance of incense. Yet behind those jewelled walls the reality was far darker. There were no fairy tales here, only nightmares wrapped in protocol legitimized as tradition. The machine of dynasty devoured its daughters, leaving silence where laughter should have lived. Even the enemies of the Sultan, fierce as they were, would not have wished such a fate for their own blood. The scream of Fatma was not just a sound lost in the night. It was the first crack in a wall of silence that had stood for generations, a fissure through which the buried truth can still be glimpsed. And it is by following that fissure that we will descend into the hidden chambers of the harem, into the stories of women whose names history tried to reduce to whispers. Fatma's agony is our entry point into that world, a place where the daughters of power paid a price written not only on their bodies, but etched into their very sills. Before we sink deeper into this shadowed story, if you're drawn to uncovering the hidden truths of history, the ones polished chronicles tried to erase, make sure to subscribe and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. I find it remarkable that from so many corners of the world we gather here bound together by curiosity across centuries and continents. The cry that broke the dawn cannot be understood without stepping back. To grasp how a princess born in the centre of absolute power could be reduced to a prisoner of her own blood, we need to examine the machinery that shaped her destiny. For the Ottomans had built a dynasty where glory was an altar and cruelty an inheritance. Since 1299, the empire had advanced like an endless tide swallowing cities, mountains and peoples. After 1453, when Constantinople fell and became Istanbul, the city pulsed at the crossroads of east and west, merchants, armies and prayers all converging on its stone arteries. Topkapi Palace, raised on a hill that surveyed the Bosphorus, was more than architecture. It was a breathing organism, each courtyard a lung, each passageway a vein, each ritual an unbroken heartbeat of domination. Inside, the air was thick with incense from the mosques, gunpowder from the arsenals and fear from the harem. Splendour and suspicion lived side by side. For every jewel-encrusted chamber there was a corridor where whispers could destroy lives. Foreigners imagined the harem as an Eden of luxury, a dream of perfumed nights and satin caresses. The truth was harsher. It was a stage of iron where women were coins of loyalty, and marriage was a chain disguised as honour. And from the heart of this theatre loomed a figure whose will could reach every corner of the palace, Kozum Sultan. A woman who had once been a Greek slave, she had risen to become the mother of princes and the architect of dynastic survival. Her hand orchestrated alliances, her eyes followed rivalries, and her daughters were pawns in her strategy. Among them was Fatma, born in 1606. From her first breath, her destiny was inscribed by the weight of her surname. She was no ordinary girl, her mind glittered with unusual brilliance. Taught the movements of the stars, the verses of Persian poets, the cadences of foreign tongues, Fatma filled notebooks with diagrams of eclipses and lines of melancholic verse. She was a comet in a night sky, but in Topkapi even brilliance could be dangerous. A girl's intelligence, if too radiant, might be read as a threat. While her brothers studied the arts of war and governance, Fatma was schooled in obedience. Every glance, every word, every pause had to be measured. A sigh too long, a gaze too direct might birth rumours of rebellion. So she learned to smother her thoughts, to cage her fire, to let her light flicker only in secret. The harem, with its mosaic-tiled courtyards and murmuring fountains, was less a sanctuary than a chessboard. Concubines, princesses, mothers of princes, all pieces manoeuvred by the hand of the sultan or by factions vying for advantage. For the daughters of the dynasty, marriage was no romance, no hopeful future, it was a sentence. To be given to a vizier, a general, or a provincial governor was to become living collateral, a breathing contract of obedience. For Fatma, that sentence would come sooner than she imagined. Before we continue, leave a like and subscribe, only if it truly feels natural. And now softly tell me, where are you listening from? At the heart of Istanbul, where the Bosphorus meets the Golden Horn, stands a palace less like a building than a living organism. Topkapi was not designed to be a single structure, but a world enclosed within walls, a city within a city, breathing with its own rhythms of incense, gunpowder and whispers. To walk through it was to feel the pulse of an empire that had grown relentlessly since 1299, when the Ottomans first rose from the Anatolian frontier to devour Byzantine strongholds, Balkan valleys and Arab deserts alike. The great shift came in 1453 when Mehmed II breached the walls of Constantinople and renamed it Istanbul, sewing together east and west into one fabric. After that day, the city became the empire's central artery, pumping lifeblood from the three continents. Caravans from Persia carried silk and spices, Venetian merchants unloaded glass and dyes. Janissaries patrolled the streets with iron discipline. Every prayer, every coin, every death in battle eventually converged here, where the Sultan resided as both shadow and sun. Entering Topkapi through the imperial gate was like being swallowed whole. The first courtyard spread wide, full of movement soldiers, drilling scribes hauling ledgers, cooks carrying sacks of rice and barrels of olives. This was the palace's stomach where provisions entered, where labourers, messengers and common petitioners might briefly glimpse the empire's grandeur before being turned away. The smell here was always mixed freshly cut wood beasts from the stables, and the acrid sting of gunpowder drifting from the armouries. Pass through the middle gate and the second courtyard revealed itself with stricter order. Here the empire flexed its muscle. Rows of janissaries stood in formations like stone statues, their discipline as much a spectacle as a warning. On one side the kitchens, vast as cathedrals, churned out meals for thousands, the air heavy with the scent of roasting lamb and cinnamon. On the other, the council chambers where viziers debated the fate of provinces, stretching from Budapest to Baghdad. It was here that the choreography of processions unfolded. Scribes unfurled decrees, heralds cried announcements, and lines of foreign ambassadors bowed low, their silks rustling like waves at the foot of a throne they could not see. Beyond yet another guarded threshold lay the third court where silence thickened. Here lived the Sultan, his family and the harem. The further you walked, the more the palace seemed to exhale suspicion rather than air. Every archway was an eyelid, every lattice window a listening ear. Behind marble fountains trickled the sound of secrets carried away like water that never returned to its source. The palace's organisation was not random. It was designed to regulate intimacy and distance loyalty and fear. The courtyards were its lungs, expanding and contracting as armies departed or returned. The kitchens were its stomach, always consuming. The archives were its memory, carefully inked in ledgers. And the harem was its beating heart, hidden, guarded and dangerous, for within it the empire's bloodline was manufactured and preserved. To the outsider, Topkapi was magnificent. To those within it was labyrinthine, both shelter and snare. It embodied the Ottoman principle that power must be seen, but never fully touched. To walk deeper into its courtyards was to step closer to the Sultan himself, yet also to step into greater peril. For in this palace, intimacy with power could elevate or destroy within a single breath. Foreign travellers once painted the Ottoman harem as a paradise of satin cushions, perfumed bodies and eternal leisure. Painters in Venice and Paris imagined veiled beauties reclining in gardens, their days consumed by music and languid intrigue. But these fantasies were as false as the polished miniatures sold in the bazaars. Behind the gilded gates of Topkapi, the harem was not a garden of pleasure, but a machine of iron. It was built not to delight, but to control a theatre where women's bodies became currency and where alliances were forged in the silence of bedchambers. At the top of this system stood the Valide Sultan, the Sultan's mother. She was the only woman who could walk freely across the palace's thresholds, her word carrying the weight of law. To her, even the highest viziers bowed. The Valide was not merely a mother. She was the dynastic keystone, the one who safeguarded succession. Her approval or refusal could shape the destiny of empires, and her daughters were pawns placed carefully on the chessboard of provincial governors and generals. Below her, though still radiant in influence, was the Haseki, the Sultan's favoured consort. To be chosen as Haseki was to hold a dangerous kind of power. Her smile could soften decrees, her jealousy could poison entire households. Yet her position was always precarious, dependent on the Sultan's whims, and vulnerable to rivals eager to see her fall. Around her, alliances shifted like sand for affection. In the palace was never free of calculation. Then came the princes, each a potential heir, each raised in gilded cages, where tutors taught theology, poetry, and the art of command. Their mothers competed with one another fiercely, for a prince who rose to the throne meant not only survival, but supremacy. Yet every boy born within the harem carried a shadow, the Ottoman practice of fratricide. Brothers could become executioners of one another, and the harem mothers knew it. Behind lullabies lurked the dread of silk cords that might one day strangle their sons in the name of stability. Beneath these elite figures pulsed the machinery of service. The Kalfa's senior attendants oversaw discipline and instruction, passing on the codes of silence and obedience. The carious young slaves brought from the Caucasus, the Balkans or the steppes, filled the ranks of the harem. Some would spend their lives in obscurity, never glimpsing the sultan. Others, through cunning or grace, might rise to favour. Every gesture, how they walked, how they bowed, even how they breathed in the sultan's presence was rehearsed and judged. And watching all of this, invisible yet omnipresent, was the Kızlar Ağası, the chief black eunuch. Castrated in childhood and brought from the Nile Valley or Sudan, he wielded a paradoxical power, excluded from family, yet trusted to guard the bloodline of emperors. His office sat at the hinge of two worlds, the harem and the divan, the private and the political. No letter reached the sultan's inner chambers without his hand guiding it. No whisper from the harem escaped without passing through his network of surveillance. He was both guardian and gatekeeper, feared more than many viziers. Surveillance was constant, subtle and suffocating. Latticed windows allowed unseen eyes to monitor conversations. Corridors twisted in ways that ensured no corner was beyond the ear of a eunuch. Even silence could be dangerous, for too much solitude raised suspicions of plotting. The harem was a prison where chains were woven not of iron but of etiquette, rumour and ritual. Every woman in this system, princess, concubine or servant, was a piece in the greater architecture of power. To outsiders their silks glittered like treasure. Inside those garments felt more like uniforms. A smile could conceal despair, a bow could mask defiance. The harem was no playground of romance. It was a crucible where desire was reshaped into obedience, and where the cost of survival was often one's own soul. She was born Anastasia, the daughter of a Greek priest from the island of Tinos, and carried into the palace as a slave. Yet by 1623 she had become Kösem Sultan, the most formidable woman of the Ottoman world. To understand the harem's machinery is to understand her shadow, stretching from the marble floors of Topkapi to the frontiers of 3 continents. Kösem was not merely a mother, not merely a consort, she was the regent of an empire, the mind that pulsed behind the lattice screens. When Sultan Ahmed Vermeer died in 1617, a storm of succession began. By tradition, brothers slaughtered brothers to secure the throne, but by then the practice of fratricide was faltering. Instead, princes were locked away in the kafavoistes, the cage allowed to live but stripped of freedom. The throne passed to Osman II, then Mustafa, then back again in a dizzying sequence that revealed the fragility of imperial power. In this turbulence, the harem became less a sanctuary and more a battlefield of influence. Kösem survived it all, wielding patience like a blade. In 1623, when her son Murad IV was still a child of 11, she stepped into full authority as Valide Sultan Regent in his name. From behind the gilded grills of the harem, she managed not only the upbringing of her son, but also the survival of the dynasty itself. Murad's youth meant the empire required a steady hand, and Kösem provided it with ruthless clarity. She convened councils, whispered orders through trusted eunuchs, and orchestrated marriages with the precision of a general moving regiments. For her daughters were not cherished in the way mothers in quieter households might dream. They were chess pieces. To marry a girl like Fatma to a seasoned vizier or a loyal governor was to bind him to the dynasty with golden chains. The princess's body became the ink of a contract, her womb a guarantor of obedience. If a governor in distant Anatolia hesitated to submit a marriage to a sultan's daughter, could tether him. If a general returned from the Persian front with too much glory, the same bond could domesticate him. Daughters were tools to stitch loyalty across the empire's vast and restless span. Kösem understood this better than anyone. Her own rise from foreign captive to queen mother had taught her that survival depended on control of intimacy. She placed women in positions not of pleasure, but of leverage. She read the court like a text deciphering alliances and betrayals as if each whisper were a line of poetry. Her reach extended even into the records scribes noted her intercessions, her gifts, her pious foundations, yet always in a tone of cautious respect, as though aware that too much detail might itself be dangerous. But power exacted a toll. Behind the heavy doors of the harem, Kösem's daughters lived as offerings. Fatma, bright and tender, was destined for such a role. Her laughter, her education, even her dreams of the stars, all of these mattered less than the imperial need to fuse sword and bloodline. In the year Murad ascended, the streets of Istanbul buzzed with unrest. Janissaries grumbled over wages, and provincial governors weighed rebellion. Stability demanded symbols, and nothing embodied permanence like a princess's wedding. Thus, when Kozum walked the marble floors, every step echoed with calculation. She was not merely a mother. She was the empire itself, wrapped in silks and veils. And in her gaze, her daughter's future was already sealed, not as a choice, but as necessity. Fatma Sultan entered the world in 1606, a child of marble halls and perfumed gardens, yet her gaze was always drawn upward to the stars. In an empire that taught its sons to wield swords and govern provinces, she found her refuge in the delicate lines of Persian poetry, the measured curves of Arabic calligraphy, and the exact calculations of astronomy. Court scholars instructed her in the movements of the heavens, and she filled her notebooks with diagrams of eclipses and planetary alignments. Her margins overflowed with verses melancholic and luminous, as though she were searching for constellations not only in the sky, but also within herself. The education of a princess in Topkapi was never meant to cultivate brilliance for its own sake. It was designed to refine obedience, to polish manners until they reflected submission. But Fatma's mind glittered too brightly to be contained. Tutors praised her memory, her precision with numbers, her talent for languages. She could speak Turkish, Greek, Persian, and some Italian with equal grace. For a moment it seemed as though intellect might be a blessing. Yet in the closed world of the harem, a girl's cleverness was dangerous. Female intelligence in the Ottoman dynasty was always coded as risk. Too much wit could breed ambition. Too much curiosity could stir rebellion. A clever princess might inspire sympathy among servants, or worse, indraw among So while her brothers were groomed to command armies and recite the Quran, before ministers, Fatma was taught the art of silence. A bow delivered at the correct angle, a smile held for the proper length, a sigh carefully suppressed, these became her daily lessons. Her notebooks, once dense with star charts, were gradually pushed aside. Long hours in the library were replaced by rehearsals of ceremonial gestures. The girl who once mapped constellations was now expected to chart the rhythm of obedience. She learned to measure her words like coins, to lower her eyes when spoken to ensure her laughter never echoed too loudly in the courtyards. Each day was a narrowing, a dimming of her inner light until her brilliance was hidden beneath layers of protocol. And yet at night, when the palace was quiet and the fountains murmured in the courtyards, Fatma sometimes pressed her forehead to the latticed windows of her chamber and searched the sky. She traced the familiar constellations, whispering their Persian names under her breath. To her they were not only distant fires, but promises that somewhere beyond the palace walls existed an order greater than the harem's suffocating rules. The stars could not be silenced, even if she could. Among the elder women, whispers circulated of other princesses who had dared to think too much to feel too deeply. Some had vanished into provincial palaces, others had withered in melancholy, a sickness the court physicians described with polite detachment. Fatma listened and understood. Her mind was both her sanctuary and her peril, a secret flame she must protect, lest it be extinguished by those who feared its glow. Fatma's fate was sealed not by her own heart but by the ink of imperial records. In the council chambers of Topkapi, her name was spoken not as that of a daughter, but as a solution. The empire needed to secure loyalty, and the surest chain was blood. Thus, at only 15 years old, Fatma Sultan was promised to Mustafa Pasha, a hardened veteran of the Persian campaigns, a man twice her age and scarred by decades of war. For the council it was perfect arithmetic: bind the sword to the dynasty with the thread of sacred blood. This was no romantic match, no meeting of two souls. It was a warrant of loyalty dressed in the language of matrimony. In the Ottoman system, the daughters of the house were distributed like keys handed to viziers, governors, and generals to lock their obedience. Some brides were sent far away to provincial palaces in Anatolia, or the Balkans, where they lived in semi-exile as symbols of imperial presence. Others, like Fatma, were kept near the capital, their unions too strategic to risk at a distance. The process was meticulously choreographed. Dowry lists were drawn up with the precision of military ledgers, bolts of silk embroidered kaftans, jewels set in gold, and whole caravans of furniture and carpets. Each item was less a gift than a reminder of the empire's generosity and its control. The Pasha's household would be flooded with imperial luxuries, binding him materially as well as symbolically. To refuse such wealth or to misuse it would be an act of treachery. In the chronicles, the marriage was described in glowing terms, a festival of music, feasting and poetry. Poets composed verses comparing Fatma to the moon, Mustafa Pasha to the lion who would guard her. Courtiers recorded how the streets of Istanbul erupted with celebration merchants handing out sweetmeats to children, guilds displaying their banners in procession. But this was compliance theatre, a spectacle meant to project harmony. Behind the closed doors of the harem, the truth was bitter. For Fatma, the marriage was not a doorway into companionship, but into captivity. The girl who once traced constellations in her notebooks now felt herself inscribed into a contract she could neither read nor resist. Every jewel placed upon her body was another weight, every brocade gown another layer of chains. The procession glittered like sunlight on water, but beneath it lay the iron logic of empire. A princess was not a bride, but a treaty incarnate. The announcement of Fatma's marriage set the city ablaze with spectacle. Istanbul, already a metropolis where 3 continents met, was transformed into a stage. Banners unfurled from the minarets, their silks snapping in the wind above the domes. The guilds marched in careful formation through the streets, bakers tossing loaves of sesame bread to the crowd, candle makers carrying pyramids of wax that glowed even beneath the daylight, armourers clanging their hammers in a rhythm meant to echo loyalty. The air filled with the scent of honeyed helva and rose sherbet handed freely to children who darted between the legs of janissaries posted along the processions. For the poets, such moments were opportunity. Verses poured forth comparing the union to celestial harmony, the princess to a radiant moon, Mustafa Pasha to a steadfast mountain. Scribes recorded these lines with flourish, knowing they would be copied into court registers as proof of divine favour. In an empire strained by unrest, Janissary mutinies, smouldering provincial governors restless, this wedding was more than family business. It was regime messaging, a living reminder that the dynasty still bound city and sword in unbreakable union. But while the city glittered with pageantry within Topkapi's sealed doors, the atmosphere was very different. The palace, with its tiled courtyards and murmuring fountains, vibrated not with joy, but with restraint. Fatma's attendants dressed her in layer upon layer of embroidered silk, fastening each bracelet and necklace, with hands that trembled in silence. They spoke softly, avoiding her gaze, for they knew what she perhaps only sensed, that the celebration outside was not for her happiness, but for the empire's stability. Fatma herself, confined within latticed windows, could hear the roar of the festivities, faintly drums, laughter, the clamour of markets, but it reached her like an echo from another world. She imagined the children chasing sweets, the bakers' loaves breaking in eager hands, and the poets reciting verses to a crowd too enchanted to ask whom the words were meant to console. Yet none of this belonged to her. For the girl of 15, the wedding was not a promise of new life, but a countdown to surrender. Every hour carried her closer to the ritual that awaited. Each jewel affixed to her costume, each perfumed veil lowered over her hair, felt less like adornment, and more like a layer of ceremonial armour she had no strength to wear. The city outside sang of union. Inside, a young girl prepared for sacrifice. The 2 worlds, public festivity and private dread, never touched, and yet together they formed the rhythm of empire. They called it Terbiye-i-Mubarak, the blessed discipline, a name chosen to soften what it truly was, a program not of education, but of erasure. For Fatma, the countdown to marriage did not begin with celebrations, but with training sessions that resembled neither lessons nor prayers. They were carefully engineered rituals meant to break the will to strip a girl of her individuality, and refashion her as a symbol, a body that belonged to dynasty rather than to herself. The drills began with the body. Fatma was made to walk endless corridors of polished marble, with a vessel of water balanced on her head. A single stumble meant punishment, sometimes enforced fasting, sometimes confinement in a chamber with no windows, where silence pressed as heavily as the stone walls. Her hands, once accustomed to tracing constellations in notebooks, were folded tightly on her lap for hours at a time. Any movement, even the twitch of a finger, was noted by attendants whose sole purpose was to record her faults. The training extended to language. Words were rationed. Fatma, who had once shifted easily between Turkish, Persian and Greek, was allowed only a narrow vocabulary when addressing her superiors. Entire phrases of poetry and prayer were excised from her tongue, leaving her speech stunted, mechanical. Every suppressed word was another piece of her inner world cut away, as though her very self were being dismantled syllable by syllable. The most dreaded space was the mirror room. Here, surrounded by walls of polished glass, Fatma confronted her own reflection multiplied 100 times. She was forced to practice beaux smiles and gestures of obedience, while dozens of versions of herself stared back, fractured and multiplied. The lesson was cruelly simple. She must become her own warden forever, watching, forever correcting, forever disciplining herself. Such practices may sound fantastical, but they reflect a broader truth. Across empires, Safavid Persia, Mughal India, even Catholic Europe courts devised ways to discipline royal women. In Isfahan, noble brides were drilled in ritualized etiquette until their gestures were indistinguishable from one another. In Vienna, archduchesses rehearsed their prayers and bows before entire households of tutors. In Mughal Delhi, princesses learned the choreography of processions, every step calculated to embody imperial dignity. What united these practices was not geography but purpose, to ensure that the women of dynasties were not individuals but extensions of the throne itself. For Fatma, the effect was devastating. Each exercise chipped away at the girl who once counted stars and replaced her with a figure sculpted from silence. She was no longer meant to think, only to perform, no longer meant to feel, only to obey. The Terbiye-i was less about teaching than about unmaking. It was the empire's way of hollowing out a soul and filling the shell with ritual. By the time Fatma left the training chambers, she was already less herself. Her movements had grown measured. Her speech muted, her laughter extinguished. She walked as though invisible chains guided her steps. And yet deep inside, a faint ember still resisted the memory of stars glimpsed from a latticed window, a quiet reminder that somewhere beyond the mirrors a larger cosmos existed. If the body could be drilled into obedience, the mind required subtler chains. Fatma's training shifted from physical discipline to psychological assault, a process designed not only to silence her voice but to make her silence voluntary. The cruelest prison is not built of stone but of thought, when a captive learns to police herself more harshly than any guard. Each day the palace physicians prescribed remedies that blurred the line between cure and control. Bowls of rosewater sherbet sweetened with honey carried faint traces of opium. Herbal infusions promised to calm the nerves, yet left her thoughts drowsy and disconnected. The warm flush of pomegranate wine taken at dusk under the guise of fortification left her body heavy and her eyelids trembling with fatigue. Fatma began to lose track of hours, moments vanished into blank spaces, and waking was like surfacing from a dark pool. What she once trusted her own memory, her sense of time, became unreliable. Sleep, once a refuge, was manipulated until it became torment. At times she was woken in the dead of night for sudden inspections ordered to recite prayers or perform gestures she had practiced in the day. Other nights the attendants refused her rest entirely, keeping lamps burning bright until her eyes ached and her mind swam in confusion. Exhaustion broke down the last defences of will, making her easier to mould. Most devastating of all was the confiscation of her notebooks, the careful charts of eclipses, the delicate sketches of constellations gone. Her star maps, which had once given her a secret sense of order beyond the palace, were deemed distractions, even threats. They were taken from her chambers under the polite excuse that they were unsuitable for a young woman preparing for marriage. In truth, it was an act of erasure. Without her stars, Fatma was left adrift, a mind once guided by celestial patterns now forced to orbit only the rules imposed upon her. The court physicians, men who blended medicine with politics, recorded her changes in their ledgers with practiced detachment. They noted her pallor, her trembling hands, her periods of silence, labelling them under a single phrase, melancholiae nisa, female melancholy. To them it was a condition, a weakness of temperament, perhaps even a predictable affliction of adolescent girls. To Fatma it was the official burial of her spirit beneath a medical term. The diagnosis made her suffering legible to the bureaucracy, but also untouchable, for once her pain had a label it no longer required compassion. In this way the empire turned her own mind against itself. Fatma learned to scrutinize every thought, to smother every spark of rebellion before it could betray her. She became her own overseer, replaying the lessons of the mirror room even without glass around her. The stars she once trusted were replaced by lamps that burned her eyes, the rhythms of the heavens replaced by the artificial pulse of ritual. What had once been an expansive universe collapsed into a claustrophobic chamber, where the only sky left was the painted ceiling above her bed. The closer the wedding drew, the more Fatma's body became the canvas upon which the empire wrote its demands. What they called ritual purification was in truth another layer of unmaking, transforming her from a living girl into a ceremonial object. She was led into the palace bathhouse, a vaulted chamber where steam curled against marble walls in ghostly veils. Attendants scrubbed her skin with rough mitts until it reddened, insisting the abrasions were signs of cleansing. Rosewater was poured over her until her pores burned the sweetness, turning cloying, suffocating in the heavy air. When she winced, they murmured that such discomfort was holy, that pain was part of becoming worthy. Perfumes followed ambergris musk and jasmine rubbed into her hair and skin until the scents clashed and overwhelmed. What should have been fragrances of celebration became oppressive layers of aroma, so thick they made her lightheaded. To be perfumed in this way was less about adornment than about ownership. She was marked as a bride in the same way soldiers bore the Sultan's insignia on their banners. Fasting too was imposed under the guise of purification. Days of sparse meals reduced her body's strength, leaving her dizzy when she stood, her hands trembling even when still. The emptiness in her stomach mirrored the emptiness being carved into her will. It was not enough to discipline her body or silence her thoughts. The rituals sought to drain her very essence, leaving behind only a shell capable of smiling on command. Through it all, the elder women of the harem, the ones who had survived their own passages into captivity, offered advice in whispers. Don't resist. Close your eyes. Think of something else. These words were not comfort but warnings, fragments of a secret solidarity passed from one generation of captives to the next. They did not promise rescue. They promised survival. The coded sisterhood of women who knew the cost of disobedience was a sentence of isolation or worse. Even the etiquette of attendants revealed the stratification of this hidden world. Senior Kalfas moved with authority, directing the rituals with a precision that brooked no hesitation, while the younger Karis performed the rough work of scrubbing and binding. Their eyes sometimes betrayed sympathy, fleeting glances that Fatma caught before they lowered their gazes again. For a moment she could almost believe that among these layers of ritual and cruelty, there still pulsed a quiet recognition that they saw her not as a symbol, but as a girl being hollowed out. Step by step, the rituals stripped away everything that connected Fatma to her own humanity, her scent, her appetite, her skin's integrity, even her breath. By the time she emerged from the bathhouse, her body shone like marble, polished for display, but inside she felt scraped raw as though her very soul had been sanded into silence. The day arrived when Fatma would be delivered to the Dune Evi, the House of Weddings. From the outside, it was a structure built to dazzle, 3 stories of pale stone rising from the palace grounds, its windows latticed in gilt bronze, its entryway flanked by tokchis that burned even in daylight. To the people of Istanbul, this house was a promise that the empire endured, that even in times of unrest the dynasty could still stage magnificence. But within its walls the splendour was only a mask, concealing a script rehearsed for centuries. Fatma was led there in silence, her body encased in a corset of silk and whalebone so tight it seemed designed less to adorn than to suffocate. Each breath came shallow, each step a strain. Around her, attendants moved like shadows, adjusting the layers of her embroidered gown, ensuring every fold fell in perfect symmetry. None of them met her eyes. Theirs was a choreography of duty, not compassion. The architecture of the house itself enforced the ritual. The first chamber was the anteroom, where gifts were displayed, gold trays heaped with coins, bolts of brocade stacked like offerings, silver candelabras polished until they glowed. Here the scribes recorded each item meticulously, as though the marriage were not of 2 people but of inventories. Beyond this lay the greeting hall lined with oil lamps that bathed the marble in a golden haze. It was here that dignitaries paused, bowing to the unseen presence of dynasty before being dismissed. Only a select few could pass further, the chief black eunuch, senior attendants and witnesses chosen to observe without ever intervening. They ushered Fatma through a narrow passage into the inner chamber. The hush grew heavier with every step, as if the very air were thickening. Oil lamps flickered against mirrored panels, multiplying her image into dozens of reflections, each one a silent reminder that she was not alone even when no one spoke. At the centre of the chamber stood the bed, its frame carved from cedar, draped in linen embroidered with Quranic verses. To outsiders it might have seemed a sacred union, but to those within it was a stage set for a performance whose ending was already known. Fatma's pulse quickened. The corset dug deeper into her ribs, compressing her breath until each inhalation felt stolen. The walls, polished and perfumed, closed in like a cage disguised as sanctuary. Behind her the doors shut with a final thud. The laughter of the city, the cheers of the guilds, the verses of the poets all fell silent. Here, in the hush of the wedding house, the spectacle dissolved, leaving only the script that every princess before her had been forced to play. In the chamber of consummation, privacy was an illusion. Though veils of silk and carved screens promised intimacy, they also concealed the presence of witnesses. Behind a decorated biombo, a folding screen painted with floral arabesques waited a select group, elder matrons of the harem, minor court officials, and most chilling of all, the physician. They were not there to guard Fatma nor to offer her comfort, but to certify. Their task was clinical, to transform the most private of human experiences into legal proof that the dynasty's pact had been sealed in flesh. The ritual did not demand sight so much as sound. The attendants behind the screen strained their ears for rustling, fabric, stifled breaths, any noise that might confirm what decorum forbade them to watch directly. When they heard enough, they would inscribe it into ledgers with chilling detachment. A line of ink, "The marriage has been consummated," was all it took to translate a girl's violation into a triumph of statecraft. This practice, brutal as it sounds, was not uniquely Ottoman. Across early modern Europe, the bodies of royal brides were similarly transformed into public contracts. In Renaissance France, notaries and physicians sometimes stood just beyond a chamber door, waiting to record signs of consummation. In Habsburg Spain, witnesses peered discreetly to verify the proofs of union with bloodied linens carried out as tokens of dynastic honour. The same logic crossed borders. Legitimacy required evidence, and evidence demanded intrusion. For Fatma, the knowledge of these unseen listeners deepened her dread. Every gesture, every gasp was not her own, but part of a performance required by empire. Even the physician's role reduced her to an entry in a medical register. He was there to inspect the sheets for blood, to attest to her virginity's sacrifice, as though her body were a contract sealed in wax. To him it was not pain or trauma, it was a matter of anatomy and ink. The ledgers that resulted from such nights were dry, written in bureaucratic language stripped of humanity. The princess was joined to her husband. The marriage completed. Nothing more. No mention of trembling hands, no record of tears, no acknowledgement of a child's spirit breaking under the weight of ritual. The silence of the official text was as violent as the act itself, and so behind the silk screen a group of witnesses converted a living girl's suffering into a legal formula. The empire would celebrate it as stability, the poets would praise it as celestial harmony, but the truth reduced to whispers and muffled sounds remained locked in the chamber, where dignity was traded for obedience. The chamber fell into a hush so deep it seemed the very oil lamps dared not flicker. Then came the sound of measured steps, heavy against the polished floor. Mustafa Pasha entered his presence, filling the room with the authority of decades spent in battle. His face bore the scars of Persian campaigns' lines etched by cold mountain nights and the smoke of sieges. To the empire he was a hero of service, the sword that had defended its borders. To Fatma he was a stranger twice her age, chosen not by affection but by decree. When his hand reached for hers, it was not tenderness she felt, but possession. Each finger pressed into her skin, as though marking a claim, sealing her fate with invisible ink. His touch carried no hesitation, no question. The ceremony had already erased the possibility of refusal. Consent had been silenced long before this night, buried beneath dowry lists, processions, and rituals of purification. Fatma lowered her eyes as she had been trained, but within her chest a storm raged. She thought of the constellations she had once mapped, of the stars that traced predictable paths across the heavens. If they could move in perfect order, why had her own life veered into chaos? She tried to anchor herself to their light, to imagine she was once again at her chamber window whispering Persian names into the night sky, so all the stars felt distant now, veiled by a darkness no astronomy could chart. The act itself unfolded less as union than as transaction. Behind the silk screen the witnesses strained to catch confirmation. For them, the sounds of shifting fabric, the muffled breath of the girl, the weight of the man were sufficient evidence. Each whisper of motion was translated into legitimacy, each stifled gasp into a ledger entry. For Mustafa Pasha, the moment crowned his loyalty, binding him to the dynasty. For the empire, it sealed a pact stronger than parchment or seal. For Fatma, it was the shattering of self. Her body, once a vessel of laughter, poetry, and dreams, had been reduced to a treaty flesh offered in exchange for obedience. She felt herself eclipsed, as if she were the sun swallowed by shadow. No matter how fiercely she searched for her stars, they remained hidden, drowned in a darkness imposed by others. What should have been the dawn of her life as a woman instead became the night of her soul. When at last silence returned, it was not peace but defeat. The pact was sealed, the ledger satisfied, the dynasty strengthened. Yet in that same instant, Fatma had been broken, her body transformed into a contract, her spirit into collateral. The morning after the palace recorded only triumph. Chroniclers wrote of celebrations of banquets overflowing with sherbet and roasted lamb of gilds praising the marriage as a sign of imperial strength. But behind the lattice windows of the harem, the truth was very different. Fatma lay pale and trembling, her body racked by fever, her sheets marked with the evidence of pain. The girl who had once filled notebooks with star charts could now barely lift her hand. Her attendants whispered of bleeding that would not stop, of shivers that shook her frame even beneath heavy quilts. She drifted in and out of restless sleep, gasping as though chased by unseen terrors. At night she woke screaming, her eyes wide and unseeing, as if the shadows themselves pressed upon her chest. The physicians were summoned men who blended the sciences of Galen with Ottoman pharmacology. They inspected her with cold detachment, their hands moving her wrists, their eyes avoiding her face. Their prescriptions were mixtures meant not to heal but to quiet. Opium dissolved in sherbet syrups of poppy and rose draughts that dulled the mind until thought itself became sluggish. In their ledgers they wrote phrases stripped of humanity: nervous disorder, female melancholy, hysteria. Such words turned suffering into diagnosis, making it neat enough to file, clinical enough to ignore. They did not, perhaps could not, name what had truly broken not her flesh, though it bore its wounds, but her spirit forced into silence by ritual. Language itself failed her. Where could she begin to explain a pain that had no permitted name? From a modern lens, her symptoms would read as trauma, dissociation, insomnia, the body carrying the memory of violation long after the moment had passed. But in the palace of 1623, trauma had no vocabulary. There was only the expectation of recovery, the pressure to smile again, to appear as though nothing had happened. Every effort of treatment was aimed at restoring the symbol, not the girl. Fatma sensed this even through the haze of sedatives. When attendants asked after her health, their voices carried less concern than duty. When physicians spoke, their tone was bureaucratic, as if she were no more than a failing instrument. The girl's tears went unrecorded, her trembling unnoticed, except as another symptom to be managed. She was slipping into silence, and the silence was exactly what the Empire required. The days stretched into a blur of fever and oblivion, of half-heard prayers and the bitter taste of poppy syrup on her tongue. Each morning the city outside rang with the noise of markets and drums, but for Fatma, time no longer moved. She lay as though suspended between worlds, her body anchored in the palace, while her mind drifted elsewhere toward the stars, perhaps where she had once found order. Yet even the heavens felt far away, unreachable through the suffocating weight of her sorrow. In the official story, Fatma had fulfilled her duty. The marriage was celebrated, the alliance secured, the pact sealed. For a few days her name was spoken in council, in poems, in sermons that praised the dynasty's harmony. But almost as quickly she disappeared. The empire had extracted what it required, and once the ledger was satisfied, the girl was left to fade. From celebrated bride she became a presence half forgotten, like incense smoke dissolving into the air. Her husband Mustafa Pasha rarely visited her chambers. To him she was not a partner but a trophy, a visible sign of imperial favour. His loyalty to the dynasty had been rewarded. His household now bore the prestige of marriage to a sultan's daughter. Yet beyond that she meant little to him. He had campaigns to recall, councils to attend, and little interest in tending to the girl who trembled at his shadow. In this sense, Fatma became what many princesses had before her, an ornament of trophy diplomacy displayed once for legitimacy, then set aside in neglect. The palace itself absorbed her absence with the same indifference it applied to every sacrifice. Courtiers who once recited poems in her honour now shifted their attention to new intrigues, fresh rumours, and the endless business of empire. Attendants passed her silently in corridors, offering polite bows but avoiding her eyes. They had learned the etiquette of ignoring the broken. To acknowledge her suffering would have been to challenge the system that had produced it, and silence was safer than compassion. Fatma herself moved like a ghost through the marble courtyards. Her figure was glimpsed at dusk, trailing behind older women, her step slow, her face pale. Children of the harem whispered that she was cursed, that she wandered in silence because she had seen visions. In truth, what she had seen was the collapse of her own self, and what she carried was a grief the palace refused to name. The empire did not pause for her. Treaties were signed, armies dispatched, festivals staged. The machinery of power moved on unbothered by the girl it had hollowed. Fatma's eclipse was complete. Once a luminous presence, she had become a shadow in her own lifetime, vanishing in plain sight while the world around her celebrated victories built on her silence. Whispers began to trail after Fatma like shadows. Some said she was sick, others that she had lost her mind. Attendants muttered that she spoke to herself in the dark, that she confused the flicker of lamps with the stars she once loved. In the harem, where rumour carried as much weight as decree, such talk was enough to transform a girl into a cautionary tale. The instructors, seeing her spirit broken, quietly shifted their efforts to younger princesses and concubines, pliable girls whose obedience had not yet cracked beneath the weight of ritual. Fatma was treated with distant courtesy, as one might treat a relic acknowledged but no longer useful. She had served her function, and the machine of dynasty moved on, feeding on fresh bodies hungry for new sacrifices. In this, Fatma's fate mirrored another practice of Ottoman control, the cafes, the gilded cages, where imperial princes were confined to prevent rebellion. The logic was the same: better to waste a life in penance than to risk disorder in the empire. Princes languished in isolation, their youth drained behind barred windows. Princesses, though cloaked in silks, endured a different form of captivity, their bodies pledged in marriages they did not choose. Both were victims of a system that saw human vitality as expendable if stability could be preserved. The harem itself seemed to absorb her story into its architecture. Older women leaned close to younger ones, whispering warnings. Don't speak too loudly. Don't dream too boldly. Remember Fatma. Her name became shorthand for what happened when the machine devoured one of its own. She was the phantom reminder that a daughter of the dynasty could vanish not through execution but through erasure, still breathing, still walking, yet already claimed by silence. For the empire, this was not failure but function. Sacrifices were necessary to keep the edifice intact. A single girl's eclipse was a small price to pay for the illusion of harmony across provinces and armies. The machine ate its daughters, and in doing so it proclaimed its strength. But within the marble halls of Topkapi, the faint sound of her earlier scream still lingered like an echo no ritual could fully erase. Istanbul glittered as though nothing had changed. Processions filled the avenues. Janissaries marched in precise lines, and merchants opened their stalls beneath awnings striped in red and gold. The call to prayer rolled from the minarets like thunder across water, reminding the city that God still watched over the empire. Festivals were staged for every victory, even the smallest skirmish on distant borders. The poets of the court composed verses praising the Sultan's wisdom, while guilds paraded their banners through the markets, turning daily commerce into theatre. The empire in the 1620s demanded such brightness. Economically, Istanbul was the node of silk caravans from Persia, spice ships from the Indian Ocean, and Venetian galleys carrying glass and cloth. To let the city appear unstable would have risked that lifeblood of trade. Militarily, too, the dynasty needed its gilded mask. The empire faced tensions on multiple fronts. Persian rivals pressing in the east, Cossack raiders in the Black Sea, and the ever-watchful Habsburgs to the west. Each festival, each parade was a declaration the empire was unshaken, its heart still beating strong. But within Topkapi, behind latticed windows, the paradox was stark. As the city shone, Fatma dimmed. Once celebrated as the jewel of the dynasty, she now wandered like a shadow, her presence half hidden, her silence deeper than the Bosphorus at night. The very machinery that generated public glitter was powered by private ruin. Every firework that lit the sky had its echo in some extinguished soul within the palace. This was not an accident, it was the dynasty's logic. The empire could not afford weakness, so it staged pageantry as proof of divine favour. If the princes were caged, if the daughters were sacrificed, if individual lives were broken, then so be it. The survival of the state justified the devastation of its children. Public spectacle became the antidote to private suffering. And in that cruel balance lay the Ottoman paradox. The brighter the empire shone in the eyes of the world, the darker the shadows it cast within its own walls. Fatma, once a girl who counted stars, had become one more extinguished light unseen against the glow of fireworks over Istanbul, and yet her absence was not invisible to those who looked closely. For every celebration carried faint but present the memory of the cost proof that its empire's radiance was built not only on conquest and commerce, but on the quiet ruin of those it claimed to protect. In the archives of the empire, Fatma's name dwindled to a line. The scribes who chronicled dynasties listed her marriage, the dowry, the name of Mustafa Pasha, nothing more, no mention of the scream that once tore through the marble halls, no record of fevers or silence, no trace of a girl whose soul had been broken. To official history she was complete, a duty fulfilled, a contract honoured, a ghost erased with ink. Yet within Topkapi her presence lingered. Servants carried her memory in whispers, passing it like a secret inheritance. The Kalfas senior attendants, hardened by years of ritual, would murmur her story to younger girls in the bathhouse steam. Do not raise your eyes too high. Do not dream too loudly. Remember Fatma. These warnings became a language of survival, a way for women to shield one another with half-spoken truths. Even the lowest-ranked carriers' girls brought from distant villages learned her tale in fragments. Some said she had been cursed, others that she had glimpsed visions of angels and never returned from them. In truth, what they retold was not a chronicle but a lesson that the palace could devour even its brightest daughters, and their safety lay only in silence. Her memory seeped into the songs sung softly at night, lullabies that carried strange undertones of warning. Children of the harem grew up humming verses about stars lost behind clouds, about birds that forgot their wings. To those who listened carefully, these were not simple rhymes but coded remembrance of Fatma, the girl who once counted constellations and was reduced to a shadow. Oral memory, fragile and shifting, kept alive what ledgers refused to hold. Thus Fatma became a ghost in the corridors. She did not walk in flesh, but in dread and glances exchanged between women, in songs sung under breath, in the caution that shaped every gesture of obedience. The Empire had intended to erase her, but in doing so it had transformed her into something more enduring, a silent warning stitched into the very fabric of the harem. Fatma's tragedy did not unfold in isolation. She was not a lone star falling from the Ottoman sky, but part of a constellation of daughters whose lives were bent broken or erased by the same machinery. Her story, whispered in the harem and buried in ledgers, was the pattern, not the exception. Across generations, Ottoman princesses were offered, as living contracts, their adolescence cut short by ceremony. Ayşe Sultan married multiple times to viziers, and governors saw her body pledged and repledged whenever political tides demanded it. Mihrimah Sultan, the brilliant daughter of Suleiman the Magnificent, was joined to Rustam Pasha in a union designed not for her happiness but to bind the empire's treasury to the dynasty. Even imperial sisters like Bayhan and Shah Sultan were used to cement alliances, their marriages ensuring the obedience of powerful families in Anatolia and the Balkans. Each name in the genealogies concealed a life redirected by decree. The pattern extended beyond Ottoman walls. In Habsburg, Spain princesses were sent to distant kingdoms, sometimes across seas, their youth surrendered to treaties. In France, Medici daughters were given to men they had never met, their fates sealed at banquet tables. The logic was universal. The body of a royal daughter was never her own, it was an extension of the state. What distinguished the Ottomans was the intensity of control. Princesses were often confined to the palace until a suitable match was chosen, their lives unfolding within latticed windows. There was no romance, only assignment. A union could be dissolved and replaced if politics shifted. Widowhood often meant another marriage decreed, another cycle of obedience demanded. Fatma's eclipse was simply one more turn of a wheel that had already ground down countless others. Her interrupted adolescence mirrored theirs. Dreams of books, gardens, and constellations were consistently truncated, replaced by the pedagogy of obedience. Desire itself was erased, not merely forbidden, but rendered irrelevant. The girl's body became treaty parchment, her womb the seal, her silence the ink. By the time the scribes wrote their neat lines into the dynastic registers, the individuality of each princess had been stripped away. Ayşe, Mihrimah, Fatma, names repeated like beads on a string, their stories blurred into one function: to tether men of power more tightly to the throne. It was not misfortune that claimed them, but design. Fatma's fate then was not aberration, it was blueprint. Her suffering revealed the architecture of empire itself, an empire that demanded the sacrifice of its daughters to sustain the illusion of permanence. The domes of Topkapi still gleam beneath the Istanbul Simdor sun, their tiles catching the light as though nothing beneath them was ever shadowed. Visitors walk its courtyards today in awe, tracing marble floors polished by centuries of footsteps. Yet the walls will not tell what they witnessed. They will not speak of the screams muffled in chambers, the girls prepared, like offerings, the lives consumed to bind generals and governors to a throne. Official records prefer the language of triumph treaties, secured dynasties, preserved alliances, sealed. but those golden domes were purchased with an invisible invoice, the tears of daughters whose names shrank to footnotes. Fatma Sultan's cry in 1623 was not the only one, only the one we caught through a crack in silence. Behind her stand countless others, their voices erased by the machinery of ritual. The empire demanded their bodies as treaties, their obedience as proof of stability. It was a system where compassion had no role for power. Without compassion, repeats only as tragedy. The Ottomans were not unique in this Europe. Persia, and beyond all, turned women of dynasties into collateral, but the cruelty was no less devastating for being common. And yet memory resists erasure. Servants carried whispers, hongs held fragments. Oral stories became counter-histories that preserved what ledgers denied. To remember Fatma is not to indulge in morbid fascination, but to practice dignity, to name what the empire refused to name, to honour the humanity that official history stripped away. Each act of remembering is an act of refusal to let the machinery of power bury the suffering it caused. Even today, echoes remain. Whenever institutions attempt to regulate intimacy, to transform private lives into instruments of state, the old logic flickers again. Whenever a human being is valued not for who they are, but for what they secure, the pattern repeats. Fatma's story warns us that behind pageantry often lies pain, and that no empire, however radiant, is free from the cost it imposes on its most vulnerable. As you reflect on her story, I invite you to carry this memory forward. Question the beauty of palaces that hide suffering. Question the histories polished clean of tears. Share these stories, speak them aloud, refuse the silence. Because the golden domes of empire may dazzle the eye, but their foundations are stained by what the walls will not say. And only by remembering can we break the cycle of forgetting. If this story has moved you, consider subscribing to Hidden Timelines. Leave a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. I'm always struck by how curiosity binds us across oceans and centuries. Together, by keeping memory alive, we refuse to let the invisible victims of history vanish into silence. The story of Fatma Sultan, imprisoned within the golden labyrinth of Topkapi and sacrificed on the altar of dynastic stability, is more than a fragment of Ottoman history. It is a mirror that reflects timeless truths about power, silence, and the human cost of ambition. On the surface, it is the tale of a young girl, brilliant and sensitive, reduced to a treaty incarnate. But beneath that surface lies a lesson that extends far beyond the marble halls of 17th century Istanbul. First, Fatma's life reminds us that institutions, however grand, often protect themselves at the expense of individuals. The Ottoman dynasty preserved its continuity by consuming its daughters, just as other empires demanded sacrifice from their most vulnerable. The logic was always the same: stability justified cruelty. Today, while the forms are different, the principle endures wherever systems be they, political, corporate, or social value results more than people. Fatma teaches us to ask a vital question. Are we building structures that serve humanity, or are we allowing humanity to be broken to serve structures? Second, her story highlights the danger of silence and erasure. In official chronicles, Fatma is reduced to a line in a genealogy, her pain scrubbed clean by bureaucratic ink. Yet memory persisted through whispers, lullabies, and the courage of women who refused to let her vanish. This tension between silence and remembrance is universal. Each time we witness injustice but remain quiet, we repeat the work of the scribes who erased her. Each time we remember and speak, we resist the machinery of forgetting. Third, Fatma's eclipse reveals how dignity can survive even in fragments. Though stripped of freedom, she held onto the stars she once mapped, keeping them alive in her imagination as a private language of resistance. Her inner life, though crushed, was never fully erased. This resilience is a lesson for anyone who has felt powerless, even when external circumstances deny us control. Holding fast to inner truths, our values, our memories, our sense of self, can preserve a flame no institution can extinguish. Finally, her story warns us that pageantry often conceals pain. The fireworks and feasts of Istanbul in 1623 masked the devastation of a single girl. In our own time, glittering facades, whether they are political slogans, corporate campaigns, or curated images on social media, can hide suffering behind their brightness. Fatma's fate reminds us to look beyond appearances, to ask whose tears are being shed to keep the spectacle alive. The lesson is not despair, but vigilance. Fatma Sultan's tragedy shows that greatness without compassion corrodes, and that societies are judged not by the monuments they raise, but by how they treat those with the least power. Her cry across the dawn of 1623 still echoes, urging us to build worlds where no voice is silenced, where no life is treated as collateral. To remember her is to honour all the forgotten daughters of history, and to affirm that our duty centuries later is not only to marvel at domes of gold, but to recognise the invisible tears that paid for them. In doing so, we reclaim history's lost voices, and perhaps we learn how to live more justly in our own time. Thank you so much for keeping me company tonight. Don't forget to subscribe so we can share many more stories together.